for me, that was the most mind-opening experience after the intensity of working in the sort of commercial law field in London, to go and just have this time to kind of exist and eat tapas and drink and chat to people without
being on the clock.
Without being on the clock, and without necessarily having, a particular agenda or everybody was there for 1,000 different reasons. And so it was an amazing time. And I look back at that period and I think, wow, that was just so incredible.
Welcome to The Little Black Book, a podcast for entrepreneurs by entrepreneurs who provide their first-hand experiences to help others learn and grow. This podcast is brought to you by Altitude Advisory. Altitude Advisory is a modern business advisory firm helping business owners build a better business for a better life. In this episode of The Little Black Book, I'm joined by Nick Dunstone. Nick is a lawyer and corporate restructuring professional who, together with his partner Sophie, founded the Light Cultural Foundation, a not-for-profit organisation and registered charity designed to be a beacon for creativity while maintaining a focus on the well-being of its people. Located in an 1880s heritage-listed building in Adelaide, it contains an innovative and world-class performance space, restaurant and bars that they hope will be transformative to Australia's performing arts culture and pave the way for emerging creatives to engage with new performance canvas. In this episode, Nick shares about his interest in group dynamics and philosophy that were initially triggered by the movie The Life of Brian and the book Lord of the Flies. He shares about how being an outlier in his career helped him identify opportunities and attract like-minded people to his vision for the future. Nick discusses how he's been able to build a team of experts to help him run the operations of Light, enabling him to focus on the big picture, opportunities and strategy. He also shares his philosophy on charitable giving and the importance of contributing to those people that may not have been as fortunate as yourself. Thanks for joining me, Nick.
Pleasure.
Favourite movie of all time?
I would say probably The Life of Brian. It was a movie which I think typifies that period of time when I was younger and just working out what, how comedy and politics and religion and philosophy all intersect beautifully.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously, if you watch it now, it feels a bit dated, but gosh, the material in that is just fantastic.
Yeah.
And of its time, it was, quite revolutionary. So I just think it's a brilliant example of art, reflecting society and the depth of the comedy and the understanding of philosophy that went into that. Just incredible.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. I've actually had somebody else come up with exactly the same.
I've got to meet this person.
You literally just passed him on the doorway coming in.
What, he also named a Monty Python movie?
Correct. No, Life of Brian. We actually literally had that chat 40 minutes ago.
I assumed, Andrew, that I would be on my own in that. Was he English?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
It makes sense.
So,
hey, he's a smart guy.
Yeah. So there you go. I hadn't had Life of Brian come up, and now I've had it twice in a day.
Well, I was thinking about the meaning of life, but actually, The Life of Brian is a better example of both of those movies are fantastic exculpations of philosophy and comedy.
Yeah. No, it's a great share. What about a book, mate, that you read as either as a child or a young adult that had a real impact on you, and why was that?
So it's an interesting one. I mean, I am blessed and cursed with an extremely bad memory, which means that I am very forward-looking. Yeah. That's the blessed part. The cursed part is remembering particular things. But I mean, I was reflecting about this, and I think probably Lord of the Flies when I was that young adolescent, and again tying back to philosophy and society. I mean, it is a brilliant book, but I remember that having an impression upon me, particularly as it's sort of exploring, group dynamics and means of violence and groupthink and socialism and, all those sorts of things. So, I guess probably would have been about 13 when I read that.
Yep.
But yeah, great book.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, it's interesting. That one's come up on numerous occasions too with this. And I think it's interesting as we look that there is these themes that I consistently see with these interviews that I do with leaders about, the philosophy or the politics or the leadership dynamics of groups and things like that, and the impact that some of these early influences have had on people as they've developed and evolved as young people. It's amazing the similarities that I see. So there you go.
I was, Andrew, thinking I was going to be original, and I'm just a replica of everybody else that comes in.
A unicorn.
Yeah, no.
You've had the opportunity to travel a fair bit, career-wise and things like that. You and your wife Sophie and kids spent a lot of time, obviously, in Hong Kong with your corporate business. But is there another travel experience or any particular part of your experience living overseas for a long time that has had a real impact on you?
Yeah, there are lots of them. I mean, I think, when we lived in South London back in the late 90s, early 2000s, that was a really intense experience of living the grind of London and working really hard. That's fantastic. But probably, if I was going to talk about a travel experience as opposed to a living experience, it was probably at the end of that time. Sophie and I, this is before we had kids, when we finished up in London and then moved back to Sydney in 2002, we took 6 months off. Yeah, literally kind of shed ourselves of all material things and bummed around backpacking around Europe, even though we were older. Yeah, and so we went. Drove all the way through Italy and Greece and then down into France and Spain and spent 3 months learning Spanish in an immersion school in Salamanca. Yeah, wow. And then we went down to Granada and did another month, and then we went to Argentina and Chile. And so it was a very different travel experience when you've got time and you don't have pressure, because I was between the job I just left in London and what I was going back to in Sydney. Yeah. And it was just my partner, Sophie, and I, and we just had an amazing opportunity to explore and exist in the culture rather than just look at the culture. Yeah. And obviously learning the language meant that, of course, you get so much more out of it. And, you weren't allowed to speak English in the residence that you lived. So you were really forced to, engage in the language. So for me, that was the most mind-opening experience after the intensity of working in the sort of commercial law field in London, to go and just have this time to kind of exist and eat tapas and drink and chat to people without
being on the clock.
Without being on the clock and without necessarily having, a particular agenda or everybody was there for 1,000 different reasons. And so it was an amazing time. And I look back at that period and I think, wow, that was just so incredible.
That's a great share. Has there anything, or has there been anything like that you've been able to do, because you've got 4 kids, has there been anything like that you've been able to do with them at this point?
Yeah, I was at a law firm called Henry Davis York and in Sydney, and I had spent enough time as a partner there to earn what they called a sabbatical, which is basically 6-8 weeks off. Yeah. And so this was in 2011, and we took our 3 kids at that point, because we hadn't had little William, on 6 weeks in Europe. And we lived in a house in Italy, and then we lived in a house in Spain. And that was obviously very different from the kind of the sort of journeying around, but that was incredible. And, taking those kids. And then when we were in Hong Kong from, which we were from 2012 till 2018, everybody in Hong Kong travels every time there's a holiday, everyone leaves. And so, we would consistently go to places in Europe, in Japan, in China, in other parts of Asia, Canada, and that was just kind of the norm. So I think, we had a really amazing period before the world kind of got a little bit unstable in those 6 years where like we and everybody else in that Hong Kong bubble were, making the most of travel and experiencing, and our 4 kids were the very lucky beneficiaries of experiencing all of that culture.
It's such a great opportunity for kids to, and it's such a great gift to give them, to expose them to different cultures and things like that as they're growing up.
It is, and I think even the urges of travel. I mean, it's not always easy, right? Because you're schlecking it from one place to another, and you've got to be really organised and coordinated, and the fact that, you've got to act as a little unit in order to kind of, get from point A to point B, and then something goes wrong and people have got jet lag. And so I think there's an enormous bonding element and learning experience, even beyond the travel experience, just the fact that you are outside of your comfort zone and you're always having to kind of push and look after each other. I think that was a really formative path for us as a family, being a really tight bonded unit. Yeah. I think sometimes, when you don't have those experiences and you miss out on some of the opportunity to learn to look after each other because you're always in the same environment, and perhaps there isn't the need to look after each other. Or when you're traveling as a group, you really got to to have each other's back. Yeah. So I think that was amazing. And now in retrospect, looking back at the difficulties of travel, we really appreciate how incredibly lucky we all were to take advantage of that.
Mate, you just mentioned your career in corporate law, and I suppose I want to touch on your development, if you like. So, you've started off uni, gone off, worked in overseas, started off, grinding away, on timesheets and everything else, like probably a lot of, young lawyers or young professionals. That pathway ultimately took you to partnership in a law firm, then took you as a partner to Hong Kong. Can you share with the listeners and the viewers about your career transition from being an employee or a young professional employee to actually being a partner and a leader in an organisation, and the learnings along the way?
Yeah. So I think probably counter, the first, I guess the slightly different element to my career than some others is that I've always been more of an outsider than an insider. So my path to leadership has always been based upon the fact that I'm doing something differently. Yep. As opposed to doing something the same. Yep. And what that tends to do is it creates a very different, less structured approach to leadership. Yeah. Because you tend to gather people that want to be involved in whatever you're doing differently as an outsider, and sometimes you tend to ostracize, or you tend to be ostracized by people that are more about making sure the existing ecosystem protects itself. Yeah. So I think my relationship with learning to be a leader has been untextbook. Yeah. But certainly, in law firms, obviously it's very structured, but I was lucky in the sense that I had a couple of key people in my life that I really learnt about the value of thinking about things differently and approaching things differently, and learnt to build teams through their leadership and work out your own strengths and weaknesses as a leader. And I know now a hell of a lot more than I did when I started, being a partner back in, at Henry Davis York originally, back when I was, I would have been like 32. Yeah. So 18 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I think it's just the insight there, about being prepared to be different and having your own vision or, value set. Ultimately, like you said, people will follow what they believe in. And, there's obviously something there in your style and your thinking that has attracted like-minded thinking and people that want to go on that same journey with you. So I think there's just a great lesson in that itself, is that, conforming to the status quo isn't necessarily always the right way to go, or quite often not the right way to go.
Well, it's, you need a mix of both. Yeah. You need people that are prepared to continue the ecosystem, but you also need people that challenge the ecosystem. And the danger you get is when one becomes hypercritical of the other. Yeah. And so sometimes the ecosystems are very protective. Yeah. And they don't like things are different because it's a challenge to the way that existing system is operating. And so, you get this balance, and I see that. We see that dynamic all the time play out in society. But you do, I think, the thing that I loved about working overseas, and sometimes I'm a little bit more frustrated about in Australia, is that there is a suspicion of people that want to do things differently here that isn't quite the same overseas. Yeah. And so, I think we need more people to continue to bravely push the barrows of what is normal practice, and to adopt risk in a way which is applauded rather than, oh my gosh, he might fall off or he might, there might be a failure and wouldn't that be terrible? I mean, we've got to get over that sort of fear of that anxiety of failing.
Yeah. And look, I think there's a stigma that attaches to that in Australia that probably isn't as the same, in Asia or the US or Europe about failing. There is that baggage that comes with that, and the dark whispers in the corner and the finger pointing and things like that. That I would say culturally it's a real problem here.
I agree
in relation to that compared to other cultures. So, Mo, I think that's a great insight. So, mate, this is a great segue, and your topic or about doing things differently is a great segue into what's going on with you now. So you and Sophie a couple of years ago came back to Adelaide from Hong Kong. I suppose running your corporate restructuring business, or you're part of that from here in Adelaide and commuting back. But you decided to establish what I'll call a cultural hub, for the want of a better description, here in Adelaide, which is very different than the norm of, I guess, what's been going on. It's a new and exciting and really innovative vision that you've got and tried to create. What's the motivation behind it? What drove you to say, okay, well, we're going to leave Hong Kong and come back and then we're going to go and buy a building in Light Square and we're going to put heaps of LED screens and a restaurant and a bar and create this hub of culture in a random part of Adelaide. Talk us through that.
So I guess the first observation to that, which is an interesting summary, is that nothing in that sequence is necessarily terribly pre-planned. And life is typified by being open to opportunities and seizing them, and therefore there's not a sort of management consulting textbook to I'm going to do this at this point and then I'm going to B to C. So, but the evolution of how that happened was, it's pretty simple, really. My two eldest children were both going to high school in 2018. Sophie and I knew we didn't want to live in Hong Kong forever. So we'd made a decision a couple of years before that we were going to move back to Australia where family was, and we wanted our kids to have that growing up experience. And high school was an obvious transition. And we could either go to Sydney or go to Adelaide. The reason we went to Adelaide is that my partners in my fund, I sort of said to them, look, I'm going back to Australia. I either can do fly in, fly out, or I can find another job. And if I'd had to find another job, I would have had to go to Sydney. But fly in, fly out doesn't matter where you are. And so we agreed that it was the right thing to do to stay with the fund. So in 2018, we moved back. And the first 2 years of that, which were pre-COVID, was a period of a lot of travel, both to Hong Kong and to Europe and the US, where I was doing various restructuring deals. That was pretty exhausting because it's actually further to travel than so I probably spent 70% of my time on the road. And then, which was kind of fine but tiring. And then in 2020, basically I was in the middle of something in the UK, actually in Scotland, and it was just becoming apparent, and Qantas kind of put out the word that you've got 1 week to get back before flights are gonna start being cancelled, and that was in April 2020. Came back, sitting in ISO going, wow, the world's really changed. I'm not quite sure what's going to happen. Now's the time when community needs help, and we're lucky enough to be in the capacity to be able to provide some hope and to give back to the community. And we've been the lucky beneficiaries of being part of the financial system, right, and therefore getting remunerated in a disproportionate way to our value add to society, as happens in the financial system. And we believe that it was important that this was a time for us to provide opportunity and hope for creatives and art and people that and Adelaide. Part of it was Adelaide. So originally, the idea was germinated because I used to play in bands when I was younger, and music's in my blood. It's in Sophie's blood, and we felt that because artists were hurting so bad, not just giving them something where they're doing the same, but something that was really new and cutting edge would at least give them inspiration and hope about or the way their performances and the way their art forms would work into the future. So people would be forward looking rather than, in that fear factor that we were always at. So the concept of the, if you like, the immersive performance venues came from years of observation on my part of watching performers, speaking to performers, speaking to people in the industry, watching really large shows all around the world, watching really intimate shows. And I always felt that there was a kind of a missing link between the engagement of the artists and what had happened on the touring schedules, the engagement of the punters in many of these big touring schedules who weren't really getting necessarily very great experiences. They were kind of there for, the sort of the selfie, being there as opposed to the experience of itself. And there was an enormous amount of infrastructure because the industry had shifted from making money from records into making money out of touring and putting on these elaborate sort of shows that were tending to be more like sort of fireworks presentations than they were actually sort of an artistic engagement with the audience. Not always the case, but tending to be. And I always thought, look, when I went and saw an artist, in those more intimate venues, it's just, they were the performances you always remembered. And so the idea was, what if we took some of that wondrous technology that's out in the really big stadiums and we put it into an intimate environment that where it wasn't being built up and teared down the next day as those places of it, but it was a permanent infrastructure so that young artists could experiment and audiences could experience intimacy in these completely flexible digital environments. And so hence, the idea of creating these immersive performance venues was created. But we felt that because we're about looking after people, that we wanted to wrap that in hospitality. So rather than it just being a performance venue that sort of sat on a rock, actually creating a hub of an ecosystem that consisted of hospitality, performance, film, and bringing that all together into a highly tech sort of driven business was something that was worthy. And it has evolved endlessly. And if I looked at what we've done now versus what we expect to do, of course, entirely different. But we're patently aware now that the things that we're doing inside this space are indeed it's the enabler for creatives to experience the way they're going to work into the future. And also it's the way for people to understand what technology is going to be for their lives. So the project is probably 5% into its existence. I use the analogy that, I don't think of this as our project in the sense that it's like creating a living organism and it's a child, probably it's got nappies on at the moment and it will, go through those teenage years and hopefully eventually it will be, set free from its own funding sources. But it's got a long way to go, but the potential to harness technology to recreate performance experiences is extraordinary.
So I think this is fascinating, having come, this is a wildly different venture than anything you've ever done before in terms of, restructuring or professional services and so on. What are the challenges that you found, I guess, individually or from a business model perspective in terms of the space, and COVID aside, which, I think we can probably touch on that a little bit later, but just from a business model perspective, running a hospitality and an arts creative venue is very different than doing corporate restructure.
Sure.
Have you transitioned? Have you balanced the two different areas, if you like, of personality and expertise with the people you're dealing with and so on?
It's been an enormous learning curve. And the first thing, probably the most important thing, is to recognise that this was not my skill set and to bring in expertise. So I have a CEO, we've got a director of people, we've got a CFO, we've got a management team, because I need to make sure that I can spend my time doing my day job rather than focusing. So very much I have adopted the role as kind of the executive chairman, if you like, as opposed to to running the day to day, because it's not my skill set. And I recognise that. But it has been both incredibly rewarding and challenging at times, because you're right, the people you're dealing with are very different from the sort of corporate universe. And the way in which you lead those people to create their own drive and passion for the project, because we really need people that are passionate about the outcome as opposed to just coming to work effectively, is what it's all about. So, I mean, I think probably I've learned in so many ways about, again, that element of having to create the vision, but then the practicalities of the ins and outs of the widgets of the business, obviously, incredibly complicated. We've got like 40 employees and hospitality is not easy at the best of times, and, dealing with sort of the award related issues and dealing with, performance related issues. Obviously, we want to be best practice in terms of looking after our people. So it's complicated. It's complicated, but I would say that what I have done in my day job is not terribly translatable to what happens day to day within Light. But as I say, I recognise that by having a really fantastic management team led by Amanda Pepe, who's our CEO. And she is able to make sure we bring all those things together. And obviously, it's a very different approach in terms of structure. When the fund is, of course, for profit and managing enterprises, this is a not-for-profit where, in fact, looking after people is our primary goal and objective. So they're very different things, sometimes a bit like oil and water, I think.
I can also imagine, though, even though Light is a not-for-profit, it still needs to be run as a for-profit enterprise.
Absolutely.
Because obviously the more profitable or efficient that is, the more you can reinvest back into the experience. And
you're right. I mean, it's critical. I mean, the path that we're trying to go down is to find that mix of commercial and purely creative mix, and there's a lot of things in the between that will mean that we don't, and government doesn't need to fund this arts organisation into the future. So that it doesn't have to be tied to philanthropists or government or organisations, and that is a very rare outcome if we can achieve it. And we're probably 30-40% of the way on our journey to do that. I can see that we'll get to that point, within a year or two, but it takes time. And obviously we've had COVID, so it's been a little more challenging to get the revenue stream, the income stream right. But what we need to do, and one of the reasons why I'm delighted to speak to people like you, Andrew, is really engage the business community in Australia and South Australia on wanting to use Light for events, for industry meetings, for forums, both from the hospitality perspective and from the technology perspective, because we can take, teams of people to anywhere in the world inside our immersive rooms or inside a building, the design of a building, or on a winery, or on a beach in Kangaroo Island, or whatever, or your mining site up in Moomba. So engaging that community will be the path for us achieving this self-sustainability.
So just to, for the benefit of people out there listening, tell us a bit about that corporate experience. So, you go to Light, you can have we'll call it a leadership retreat or whatever you want to call it, sitting in the venue, having your corporate meeting, sitting in the Grand Canyon, for example.
Yep. So, we've had product launches, some examples, and Fleet, one of the, Flavia of, great ambassador for technology innovation in South Australia. They had their launch of their satellite there late last year. And, what you can do with a room of people where you are completely surrounded by the environment that you want to be in, particularly when you're talking space and technology, is quite extraordinary. And it makes a huge difference to the power of a presentation when it's not just behind you, but actually you've immersed yourself in that audience, in that environment, whether that be, as I say, on the moon, or showing off the new satellite launch space, or be it on a vineyard we've done this for wine companies, or be it, JLL had a big event there last year, and they took all of their big clients to each of the big JLL buildings, and so you were transported to those places over the course of dinner and drinks.
Amazing.
So to explaining technical items. So we've worked with a company called Aerometrics, another South Australian company that does sort of geo-mapping, and we've had South Australian sort of tourism events that have been able to show the different tourist sites through, sort of coming in from space and then down into those particular spaces and travelling virtually down North Terrace. But it's a really engaging experience.
Yeah.
And ultimately, these are ways of telling stories.
Yeah.
And these are ways of imparting information that will be more engaging for the audience that you're speaking to. So it's very much in the hands of the business. What story do they want to tell?
Yeah.
Do they want to sell a product? Do they want to show that product?
Yeah.
We did a big spirits launch last year, people sort of having fun and, being on a beach, and then huge spirit bottles that are the size of people. Do they want to provide education? We've done some Indigenous, First Nations sort of education workshops in there. Do they want to have a product launch? Do they just want to have a board meeting?
Yeah.
We had a board meeting the other day where they were in, Italy. Then they went and had dinner next door, at Aurora.
Yeah.
So it's very diverse, but wherever you want to be able to transport people to a place without actually having to transport people to a place and then have an amazing dinner, that's the sort of combination that works really well within Light.
Yeah. And I think that's a really, I guess, in just to extend on that point, for businesses to thrive, ultimately they have to create a connection with their, an emotional connection with their customers, their clients, however it might be.
Yep.
And this is just another enabler for businesses to be able to make that connection between their product, their service, whatever it might be, with ultimately their consumer.
Absolutely, Andrew. And I think the other, apart from giving people great experiences and being able to engage people in something that is only in Adelaide out of all of Australia, this is really bespoke, to give people those experiences and to translate an idea with my tech team into that actuality is fantastic. But then also to emphasise that you're inside an area where there's one of the best restaurants in Adelaide that's connected to it, that's able to provide that hospitality. Yeah. You're in this beautiful old historic building that's, got character oozing out of it. And then I think that, the thing that I really love to talk about, and I'm often asked to talk at some of these events, is the social enterprise part of it, because by that organisation choosing to have the event at Light, they are actually forming part of the community ecosystem that is supporting artists and creatives to be able to use this really expensive technology, but this technology that is enabling them to practice their art and work out ways of engaging audiences in the future. Yeah. So it's very much a continuum from, as I say, the commercial to the artistic use. Yeah. And I want the commercial people that come and use it for commercial purposes to have that sensation and that feeling that they're really giving back to community, and hopefully their clients feel that too. Yeah. So it's a very deliberate choice to choose us over maybe some other, event spaces, even aside from the bespoke nature of the way we can curate the event itself. Yeah.
I'd love to explore that a little bit more, because, you mentioned really early when we were talking about that disproportionate match between, your financial rewards out of your corporate life versus what's giving back to society. And, that's quite a common situation in, for really successful, business people and entrepreneurs, and quite often they think that, their social enterprise is, giving a donation to, their alumni university or school, or, a few $100 donation to a local charity or whatever it might be. You and Sophie have got a very different view on I'll call it, your social responsibility here. What's the connection and driver for you guys particularly, and how important is that in your value set in terms of making that work?
So the value set, is everything. If we were driven by growth, meaning material growth, which probably most people are, then you would, give away a small proportion that you felt was the right, and that's typically what people do. I think we've just seen, life is so indiscriminate in the way that it rewards people financially. And I'm not suggesting I haven't worked hard and done all those things, but why in the finance sector do we get lauded? Why should you be paid 20 times what a nurse is paid or someone? So, these societal questions we can't answer, but if you are lucky enough to be the beneficiary of that, I believe, and Sophie believes as well, that, you have an obligation to not try and grow your cars or your houses, but, once you have got to a point where you can look after yourself, more, reasonably well without being opulent, that is your obligation to give back. And I think for us, I've observed obviously a lot of families that have been very wealthy and it's not always great for their kids. It often works out to be to the detriment of the family.
Yeah, yep.
I think, to be able to give a lot of capital and time, thousands and thousands of hours and passion and drive and vision into something that's really making a difference for the community is something that's a gift, for yourself and for your own culture. And it's both an obligation, but you're enormously privileged to be in a position to be able to do that.
Yeah.
And so, when I think about our choices, because these are choices, these are very deliberate choices that are made about us using the luck and the benefit that we've had in society to give back to something that isn't just supporting a need, but ultimately is aimed at creating something that will be self-perpetuating. And that for me is the most exciting part of the value chain. So by putting in your passion and your energy and your capital into something which given time can be its own existent being, like giving like a child that can continue on and can work for 20, 30 years or 40 years. You think about the number of people's lives and creatives and experiences that can be generated if we can get that ecosystem. That's what really excites Sophie and I is this concept of creating something that's self-perpetuating and is continuing to give back to the community.
You're creating a legacy.
Yeah, and a legacy is a funny word because it's tainted, but because it means it's a legacy that's related to us. I'm less about the legacy and more about, again, taking it back to that analogy of a child. You're proud of your kid.
Yeah.
But it's not you.
No, that's
Do you know
right.
what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I kind of hope light gets to that point where it's not synonymous with Sophie or I.
Yeah.
It's just something that we happen to have been lucky enough to create, but then it's got its own existence that is supporting, cutting edge creativity around Australia and then, potentially around the world.
Yeah.
Because we'd like to replicate these to other places.
Yeah.
Because we think there's a great social enterprise model. And obviously the amount of impact you can have on society is directly correlated to the amount of people you can touch, which means you've got to open more venues.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
It's a great story. You mentioned COVID before, it's you could have probably, with a bit of hindsight, opened it a better or worse time in terms of some of the challenges you've had hospitality-wise and restrictions and building delays and all sorts of stuff that goes with that. Aside from the obvious, what other challenges have you personally faced in your career and how have you overcome them?
Apart from light, more generally, and the challenges, particularly in the restructuring universe, you're always involved in crisis. And so, learning how to manage your own, mental health and your emotional well-being to other people's reactions when you're dealing with those crises and the pressure is tricky.
Yeah.
And so I think making sure you step back to sort of acknowledge the complexity of some of these situations, without necessarily always trying to solve. Sometimes the best solving is time.
Yeah.
And also the other learning, I have is, there's not always a right decision. There's just a decision.
Yeah.
And in crisis management, that is absolutely true.
Yeah.
So I think, those sorts of strategies where you can own a decision, but recognize that you're creating a leadership path, but then being incredibly open to it deviating to in different directions is really what crisis management is about, which is a lot of what I do in my restructuring job. But, the challenges of COVID, and Andrew, you mentioned, we opened up in COVID, so we knew. So we can't pretend that we didn't know COVID was a function. And in fact, it was a response to the need for newness and innovation and pioneering in the creative sector because what had happened to COVID. To be fair, we did not anticipate what happened, particularly during last year.
Yeah.
And, that was very difficult for the business because we rely on interstate visitors all the time. We rely on people wanting to go out. We rely on interstate artists coming in to perform so that we can provide all sorts of different engaging experiences. So it was very challenging.
Yeah. It's interesting, and I love your comment there about making a decision and, not necessarily it being right or wrong. They often say, the worst decision you can make is not making a decision at all. So I think your insight there of, make a decision, pick a path and go with it, and it is a really important leadership lesson, especially in a time of crisis. So mate, that's a really good learn.
It is, but it's hard because, when you are choosing between A and B or C and D and A1 and A2 and A3 and, all of that myriad of complexity, you're acutely aware of the consequences, the direct consequences that any one of those will have. But actually the complexities associated with some of these dynamic systems in making decisions is very hard to know.
Yeah.
But if you approach it from a scientific and a rational basis and try to make the right decision, you just eat yourself up.
Yeah.
And I think I agree with you. I mean, I think leadership is about owning a decision, but recognizing that we might need to pivot in different directions and being prepared to do that and not being too stuck.
Yeah.
And that, that certainly pivoting, I think, is the overword use of our times at the moment. But I think, it's true. You do need to be able to, turn on a dime, and turning on a dime's tough when you're leading a group of people or an organisation because people get whiplash.
Yeah, no, for sure. You mentioned mental health and obviously, managing, through crises and different things like that. Do you have a group of mentors or coaches or anybody like that helps you?
No, I don't, but I've had lots of people, in my prior experience who have definitely been mentors, but I don't really have anybody at this point. And one of the things that's, tricky is if you're doing something completely new, it's hard. I mean, I have people in the industry who are, in the film industry and in the business industry who I guess I would regard as mentors to some very informal degree, and people that I bounce ideas off.
Yeah.
But no formal sort of processes or coaching. Probably could do with some.
Okay. What about a life motto, mate? Do you have one?
I've never tried to articulate it, but I think my motto would be always be open to the opportunities because they're everywhere. Step away from, as Kevin Rudd used to call it, programmatic specificity, right? To be open to possibilities sometimes means you are not as structured as some, and there's enormous benefit for being a pioneer in not being overstructured, because structure is great, but it also sometimes means you get stuck on a certain path that might close your ability to see certain opportunities. So, I think it's all about appreciating the wealth of opportunities and a capacity to work out how you engage with those opportunities, because they're everywhere.
Yeah.
But, we all see 20% of them because we're all focused on our particular zone.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, mate. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you, Andrew.